Hello and welcome to YA ThrillerCon. Today we've got an interview with Laurie Elizabeth Flynn, who also writes as L E Flynn, and she's an amazing thriller writer. So I'm really excited to be talking to you today. So, firstly, thank you so much for joining me, Laurie.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the work you do. I love YA Thriller Con and I'm always so happy to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. So should we get started? Do you want to sort of introduce yourself to viewers who haven't come across your books before?
Yeah, absolutely. I've written, my name is Laurie Elizabeth Flynn. Some of my YA novels are written under L E Flynn. My two YA thrillers that I've written are called Last Girl Lied To and All Eyes on Her. And I've also written an adult suspense novel called The Girls Are Also Nice Here. I'd say that most of my thriller novels, whether they be YA or adult, are very character driven and deal with a lot of like intricacies in relationships. And I'm definitely more of a psychological suspense as opposed to like blood and gore. I really
Mm-hmm.
like mind games, and I like to also sort of add layers of societal um, kind of expectations on girls and women. That's plays a big part in my work, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So those are sort of a little bit about what you could expect from my books. A lot of tearing into double standards as well as unraveling mysteries.
It's great. And yeah, like I've read Last Girl Lied To, and I've actually got your other YA thriller on Audible, so I'm going to be listening to that one as soon as I finish my current read. But yeah, I really loved Last Girl Lied To, and that was the first book of yours that I'd read, and I found it really haunting, like the way that you write, because like there's some lovely images in there, and it's almost poetic in places. And when you've got sort of these really like dark topics of like loss and tragedy and regret that you're exploring, and yeah, like I enjoyed reading it so much, and I almost felt like I was addicted to reading it. Like I just couldn't turn the pages fast enough. And you're really masterful at like maintaining suspense. So yeah, I'd love to know a bit about the writing process for that book and whether that's sort of a typical writing process for you, or if it was particularly different for that one.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. That literally means so much to me hearing that
Oh.
you thought that about the book. I will say the writing experience for that book was very strange for me. Up until then, I'd never written a thriller. And to be honest, I didn't go into it planning to write a thriller. It just sort of happened. It's just sort of where this story took me. And my debut novel, First, is it's a contemporary. It's not a thriller at all. So I did not expect my second book to sort of go into that territory. But there's like this mystery around with that. That said, the first draft of this book was totally awful and nothing like what the story ended up being. I realized that I didn't know how to write a thriller, and it was boring and there weren't clues dropped through. So I rewrote the entire thing. I think I, got rid of some characters who were completely not adding anything to the plot and really focused on character development and kind of taught myself how to layer in clues to add suspense to a book to make a reader keep wanting to turn those pages, which I think when you're an author of suspense is such an important thing. And this book has two timelines, and I tend to love to play with timelines in my writing. So when I was writing Last Girl Lied To, I timelines together. I tried to write in order, but I ended up it became like this gigantic mess. And I think I have pictures of my office from that time, and there was post-it notes everywhere from like with all sorts of random notes on it. And I was trying to put the scenes together, and it was a really an activity and a practice in learning how to what needs to go where to sort of time those reveals, which are so important in suspense, and to
Yeah.
also make sure that you're dropping clues. Because I think when you're a reader reading a suspense novel, the worst thing is when the ending is not satisfying or those reveals aren't satisfying because the author's given no clues and it's just kind of like left you there like, okay, well, I was never going to figure that out. So it's infuriating. So you need to make it, at least for me, when I'm writing suspense novels, my goal is that I want to make people want to reread it to pick up on the clues that they didn't get the first time. So that was sort of a lesson. Reading this book was really a lesson in crafting a thriller and how that's different from a regular contemporary novel, and it was a huge learning experience for me.
Yeah, it does sound like, because it was quite a learning curve really with writing a thriller, because I also write contemporary romance as well as YA thriller. So yeah, I totally understand how like different the two can be. So with your second YA thriller,
Yeah,
did you find that easier to write than having already had the experience of writing Last Girl Lied To?
I did actually, which is interesting because that book is differently crafted. There's, I think, 5 point of view narrators in that book.
Right, okay.
And so it was very different experience. And I also use a lot of like mixed media. So there's text messages, diary entries, newspaper articles, police transcripts. So there's a lot of different formats going on. And I ended up with my brilliant editors sort of restructuring it from what I had originally to sort of drive up that tension. So, but I did find that in general, it was easier to draft that book than it was Last Girl Lied To. I think if I look back, Last Girl Lied To is probably the most frustrating book. I've the one that really showed a near and dear spot in my heart for that reason, because I really think writing that book made me realize that I really love writing dark and twisty thrillers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, because I really liked the darkness in Last Girl Lied To, and it's very much character driven, and you're amazing at creating these characters. So I'd love to talk a bit more about sort of like how you develop your different characters and especially your villains. So at what point do you sort of know who your villain is, and does it ever surprise you?
Um, Everything surprises me when I'm writing because I don't plot. So
Mm-hmm.
I generally just kind of have an idea of a character. I have a name, it pops into my head,
Right.
and I sort of start writing. And I always consider the writing experience as me getting to know the character as I go. Um, and those characters do surprise me a lot. I might have it in my head, like, I think I know what's going to happen, and I think I know where they're going to go, and have it turn somewhere completely different because this character's trying to tell me something else. And it's one of my favorite things about writing is how, your own characters can surprise you. And
Yeah.
I guess with villains, that's another thing. I might have it in my head, um, that I think this character is going to be a certain way, and then they end up surprising me with their true nature. I will say, I guess with my books, I think everyone is sort of a villain a little bit, because I write very well. I try to write very, multi-layered characters, and
Mm-hmm.
I think having like I've read a lot of reviews of my work where people are like, oh, you know, unlike female characters. So
Mm-hmm.
they kind of get painted with that, morally ambiguous description where they're not your typical protagonist. But that's
Mm-hmm.
part of what I love, because I love reading about complicated girls and women,
Yes.
and people who make mistakes and are flawed. So I guess I don't really put my characters in those boxes of like the traditional protagonist and villain, because I kind of leave room for them to be a little bit of both.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, and I can totally see that in the book that I've read of yours. Because your characters do, they seem so realistic, and you're right, because it's not like you haven't got one good person and one bad person, because everyone does have that sort of like
Yeah.
capability to be bad, and that is just, it really adds this extra layer of realism. And yeah, I love books about sort of unlikable female characters, and it's just really really
Okay.
fascinating sort of like diving into sort of the psychology as well of these characters. And that was something I really appreciated when reading Last Girl Lied To, because although like there were so many secrets and like mistakes that these characters made, it was really believable. And like even when there was like a character who wasn't that likable, we could still understand them and they felt believable.
Thank you. That's literally like my goal when I'm writing is always, if I can make them seem believable and make their actions
Mhm.
seem like they're grounded in something. Like, I never want to do
Mhm.
anything just for shock value. I want it to seem authentic to the character. So anytime I can achieve that, I'm happy.
Great. So how was writing your first adult suspense novel then? Was that really different to writing sort of like the YA thrillers?
Yeah, it was definitely different and a challenge. I knew that with the girls are also nice here. I wanted an adult narrator, and but I also wanted two timelines. So I remember when I was first conceiving of the idea, I was like, oh, should I make it YA or should I make it adult? But I realized that since I wanted one of the timelines to have an adult narrator looking back at her college days, that it needed to be an adult novel. I do think, though, that because one of the timelines is set in the character's first year of college when they're 18, I think having a YA background really helped me to get that teenage voice right. And I loved writing that. I'd say is upper YA anyway. The characters are generally 17 or older, and the content can be a little bit mature. So I think it was felt natural for me to write a book where there was, a dual timeline where one of the timelines took place in college. And it yeah, I think it sort of naturally unfolded. I found it interesting to write adult because when I write YA, everything feels so immediate because the narrator doesn't have that reflection period of, it being in their 30s and looking back on their teenage years. Everything's happening in real time, and I love that about YA. I love that immediacy of emotions. So it was interesting to sort of do something a little bit different with the adult
Mhm.
book and have that retrospective and that ability to look back on past mistakes. And I found it really interesting. And I love writing both YA and adult, so I hope to keep doing both.
Great. Yeah, I can't wait to read this adult novel now because like the more you talk about it, the more intrigued I am, and it just sounds really great. And like especially with like the dual timelines because I love reading any thrillers. I've got like multiple timelines and dual timelines, and with what you're saying about how sort of like characters in their 30s like reflecting on their teenage years, I think that would give like a really good angle just to like explore the themes like in a slightly deeper way than in the YA books because as you say the YA is sort of like more immediate reactions. So yeah, that sounds really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. So how long does it take you then to sort of write a novel sort of like from the first idea to like the finished manuscript you'd send your agent?
Oh gosh, it really depends. It
Mhm.
varies from book to book. Generally, I write a very fast first draft, like
Okay.
6 weeks ish, or
Mhm.
6 weeks to 2 months, depending. So, but then I'm since I write such fast first drafts, sometimes they're very messy and take a lot of
Yeah.
work in revision. So
Mhm.
it's probably going to be like 4 months before I send it to my agent. I try to get it in as good of shape as I possibly can before I send it to her. And my agent is extremely brilliant and editorial. So we always revise together several times before happened with the girls are also nice here. And having that um, revision experience and working with someone else who completely understands what you're trying to say is always so great, which I always recommend writers do, whether it be your agent or
Mhm.
a critique partner or somebody whose opinion you trust, because they will pick out things that you won't and will
Mhm.
help you make your manuscript stronger. So um, you know sometimes there's this pressure to sort of churn out a book and try to get it on
Mhm.
submission or whatever it may be as fast as possible. But I think it's so much more important to take the time, get it to a point where you're happy with it and you've gotten it as far as you can, and then send it to
Mhm.
somebody else for feedback before going forward. Because I think being in a rush benefits nobody. It's always best to take your time and give the best possible product.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And like you say, like critique partners are gonna spot things that you haven't. And because like I also write quick first drafts, and I don't really plan, because if I plan, I feel like I've already told the story and then I'm not motivated to actually write it. But I always find that I've got one critique partner
Exactly.
who does like outline everything like really meticulously, and she's helped me sort of like work through plot holes before, because she's got like that experience with outlining and planning, and she has saved me so much time before when I sort of like written myself into like massive plot hole. So yeah, critique partners can be
Yeah.
so valuable. But yeah, so
Yeah.
with your books, what are you working on now?
I've been working on the second book in my adult book deal, so I'm excited about that. I've sort of pitched it as Bridesmaids meets Gillian Flynn, so it's
Oh,
kind of
nice.
tearing into the standards in the wedding industry and making that into a thriller. I think there's a lot to explore there with pressures on women, and I had a lot of fun with that. So more details about that one when I can share it. And then I'm also working on my next YA right now, and it's got similar themes to my other YA thrillers. So you're going to find those complicated female characters and twists and turns and some darker content. So that one's been fun to work on. So I'm really excited, and hoping to get a draft of that together really soon. So yeah, I'm excited.
So do you work on multiple manuscripts at the same time then? Because you've mentioned your adult one and your YA sort of like works in progress. Or do you sort of like tackle one for 1 week and then switch for the next week?
I'm yet to the, I don't have a consistent system. I sort of
Mhm.
it depends on what I'm on deadline for. That one always is going
Mhm.
to take priority. I try
Yeah.
to juggle sometimes where, if I'm on deadline for something, I'll get that out of the way and then try to work on, if I have a little bit more time, work on the other project. I wouldn't say I have a hard and fast system yet for juggling
Mhm.
books. Generally, what I've done in the past is I get the work for one done and then put it away, submit it to my agent or whatever it may be, turn it back into my editors if it's rounds of edits, then and then I
Mhm.
pull out the other project and work away on that. But I am trying to have a little bit different approach where I touch base with the manuscript more often instead of putting it aside for a couple weeks, because as I'm sure you understand, it's really hard to get back into it when you've been away.
Yeah.
So I try to sort of check in with my books, if not every day, then every other day, because otherwise it's easy to go back, like even just 2 weeks later, and totally forget where you left off. At least I that's what I find. Maybe my memory is just really bad, but I'm always a little bit in a better position if I can sort of touch base with that manuscript, and
Mhm.
even if it's just writing like a 250 words or something, just to sort
Mhm.
of keep my pulse in that world.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because I found that when I'm working on multiple manuscripts at the same time, I do sort of like need to try and stay in the zone of like each manuscript. And like I do find I start getting mixed up between my manuscripts sometimes, especially if I'm working on two thrillers at the same time. I'll sometimes start mixing up like the little clues and the foreshadowing, and they'll just start like merging together.
Yeah.
So yeah, like at the moment, if I'm trying to work on like multiple manuscripts, I'm trying to make it so that they're different genres, because then I just find it easier to switch from one to the other then, because it's like it's very different. So yeah, because at the moment I'm working on a contemporary romance for one of my pen names, and then a YA thriller. So I find it quite easy working on those two together. But like last year when I was working on two YA thrillers together, I was just like, I can't do this. It's just like I had to do one at a time, because I just needed to be in that world with my characters and just sort of like stay in the zone as much as possible. So yeah, I definitely feel
Yeah.
you on that one. Yeah. So we've talked a bit about sort of like the importance of tension, and like with the twists, and especially when you're working with these like morally grey characters. Do you have any specific tips on like how you structure a novel to make sure you've got a right rise and fall of tension at appropriate times?
Oh gosh, I think I'm the wrong person to ask, because I'm such a pantser. I
Hmm.
don't plot, and that it's fun, but it doesn't work for everyone because you do end up writing yourself into plot holes. And
Yeah.
I think for me, a lot of the structural work happens in revision, where
Yeah.
I will sort of I usually print out my first draft in like hard copy and then like completely rip it up, but like add comments everywhere and write all over it, because then it kind of, when I see it in that hard copy, it gives me permission to like just pull it apart. Whereas if it's a Word document on my computer, I can be a little bit more precious with it. So I want to give myself permission to totally, tear apart what I've done and restructure it. So I think
Mhm.
that's where a lot of the work happens for me, where I sort of realize, okay, well, this is a good act one, but then it's got this saggy middle where it totally falls apart and nothing happens for like 100 pages. So this needs to happen, and I'll go in and identify, what needs to happen to sort of, especially if it's reading, like I've had it happen where you reread it and it's like, oh, this book's pretty good, but it's not a thriller. It's not as, it
Mm.
doesn't have the tension it needs to have. It's reading more like a contemporary or something like that. So I think, and then figuring out, what do you do to make it a thriller? What kind of things could be happening to these characters? And I think the saggy middle of the book is always the challenge for me, because I love
Mhm.
writing the first part and I love writing the ending, where you get to that point where everything starts to cascade into that finale. But writing the middle is such a challenge because you have to keep up that tension throughout, and make sure that the right clues are being dropped so that the finale does hit with such an impact. So I think for me, given my chaotic sort of way to write a book, the a lot of that structural work and turning it into a true like thriller does happen in revision. And I think the revision stage is just so critical for everybody. But if you are not a plotter, then you
Mhm.
might have more revision to do. Like I have friends who are plot everything down to the detail, and I'm so in awe of them. But
Mhm.
and I'm jealous because a lot of times when it comes to revision, they don't have as much work to do because they've already planned it all.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what? It only takes you like a week to revise. It takes me like 2 months. So I think it's different for everyone, but for me, it's that revision stage, marking up that hard copy, and often then I'll
Mhm.
write myself an edit letter where I can identify the problems, and that's sort of how I tackle it.
Yeah, that makes sense because like I'm the same. Like my revisions take me so long because I end up with like this really messy first draft where nothing makes sense, and it's not really until I'm starting to revise the manuscript that I actually know like what the heart of the story is. So yeah, like
Yeah,
those people that plot everything, they have it a lot more like efficient with their time. But
I know.
yeah, like I do find it really freeing. And I'm way more creative if I don't have a plan to follow, because then I've got to surprise myself, and I know that if I can surprise myself, I can
Exactly.
likely surprise the readers too. So
Yep.
yeah, like it's just fascinating hearing about like all the different ways that authors approach their manuscripts and the writing process. Um,
Hmm.
because yeah, like with you sort of like using the hard copy during revisions, I find that really interesting because I'm kind of the opposite. If I've got a hard copy printed out, I kind of don't want to do anything to it because I kind of want to keep it like sort of like perfect as it is, like visually. So when I'm sort of like ripping my manuscripts apart, I do that all in the Word document. So I'm like the opposite way around with you.
It is so interesting how I love
Mhm.
hearing about other writers' processes too. It's fascinating. And I love what you said about being able to surprise a reader if you can surprise yourself. I always say that too, and I think it's so true. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you have any sort of like general tips for like aspiring writers or young writers who are just sort of approaching writing their very first manuscript?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say read widely, especially read in the genres that you think you'd like to write in, because it's
Mhm.
really important to sort of, be rooted in that world if you want to write in that genre. Like before I started writing YA, I hadn't read all that much YA, but as soon as I started reading it widely, it made me such a better writer as well. And I found so
Mhm.
many fascinating books. I just couldn't get enough. So, and and I think for as well, I've always been drawn to suspense novels. And
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting is just sort of when you read it critically, and if you love the book, figure out what made it so interesting for you, and then you can sort of apply these things to your own writing. Like, so this author pulled off this massive twist. Okay, well, how did that happen, and how can you do the same
Mm-hmm.
thing? So I'm always looking at reasons I loved a book or reasons I didn't. Why did it fall flat for me? Why didn't I love this so much? So looking at things critically and analytically like that can really help you be a stronger writer. So I always say being a reader makes you a better writer. And it applies like no matter how far into your career you are. I still find now if I'm not reading as much because I'm too busy or something, I don't feel as inspired. I don't feel as creative. I feel like I need to refill the well. Um, and another tip I always have for aspiring authors is just to start writing and don't worry about making it perfect, because that really
Mm-hmm.
held me up in the beginning. I was so I was just so precious with my words, and I just didn't like I'd write something and delete it because I deemed it not good enough. So that's a good way to never get anything written. So what I always do
Yeah.
now is like I try to still to this day, you're going to have days where you sit down to write and your writing sucks and it's terrible. And no matter who you are, it happens to all of us. But just plow through those days, and always it's always better to write something instead of nothing, because at least first, there's that saying, first drafts just have to exist. They don't have to be perfect. All they have
Yeah.
to do is exist. And I remind myself that all the time, because if you do try to have a perfect first draft, chances are you will never get your draft written. So I always just set goals that are manageable. So say you want to write 500 words a day or write a chapter a day or whatever it may be, and don't be so critical on yourself if it's not turning into the story that's the story in your head, if it's not coming out like that, if it's turning out flat on paper. You can always fix all that later, but for me it's so important to keep the momentum going. So just it's the most important thing to just keep writing, and that's the way that you get a draft written, and then from there you can do whatever you need to fix it up. And that's what I always wish I could tell myself when I started out, because I was such a perfectionist, and it really held me up. So I always want to save other people from that.
That is such excellent advice because, yeah, I totally agree. If you're putting pressure on yourself, you're going to be sort of like limiting your own creativity and probably not enjoying it as much either. And I think it's really important to enjoy what you're writing because readers will be able to tell if you're not, because then it's going to like have a slightly different tone or whatever. So, yeah,
So
that's
true.
really great advice. So, to finish off with, would you like to tell us which are your favourite YA thrillers?
Oh my goodness. I love anything by Kara Thomas.
Yeah.
She wrote The Cheerleaders, and her most recent one is called That Weekend, and I believe it comes out very soon. My days are all mixed up because I'm camping right now. But it's I love any sort of book that also with a thriller kind of marries like an environmental like a survival type thing too. And her book That Weekend is really, really twisty and clever. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's the perfect book to read while camping, actually. So anything Kara Thomas writes, though, I'm going to automatically buy.
Mhm.
And I also love Courtney Summers. Anything
Yep.
Courtney Summers writes is instantly going to be bought as well. I remember reading Sadie for the first time and just being completely blown away. She takes such care in crafting every sentence, and her writing is beautiful, and her characters are so deeply developed. And just the fact that she can get so much emotional depth into her work is just mind blowing. And those are two authors that I'm absolutely obsessed with. And of course, I also love Karen McManus. She's
Yeah.
brilliant. She's queen of thrillers, and her work is such great books for anyone looking to write a thriller. Like, there's an expert right there. So
Yes.
those are great books to read. Anything by Karen McManus, just because it's going to be amazing. So I feel like I there's so many authors I could rave about, but those are, some authors that I will automatically buy every single time.
Yeah, like I love all of her books so much, and Sadie was one of the first YA thrillers that I read, and I hadn't really read anything that was mixed media before either, and like with the podcast playing such like a central role, I just love
So
that, and
good.
that really got me into sort of like analyzing structure as well. And I after I'd finished reading it, I did actually reread it, sort of like analytically, doing what you were saying, basically, just like trying to work out exactly why I'd had such a strong emotional response to it. So yeah, I definitely agree
Yeah.
with you on that. Those books are just amazing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much for joining me today for this interview. So yeah, is there anything else that you would like to say to viewers?
Just thank you so much for tuning in, and there's so many great things to find at YA Thriller Con. So yeah, I'm just excited to be part of it, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.